Welcome to the February 2025 SHARP information session, where we invite speakers to offer information sessions about resources, services, and tools that are available to help English-speaking seniors to age in place or age in the right place. I want to thank all of the Quebec English-speaking community organizations, the SHARP coordinators, and all of the older adults who are with us today. If you have any questions about this presentation or the resources provided, please contact the organization and the SHARP coordinator that invited you. All right, so now I'm going to introduce Pam and Zelda a little bit more formally, and then I'm going to hand it over to them. So Pam Orzeck has extensive experience in clinical and community practice, having worked as a frontline social worker and research practitioner for 25 years, prior to joining the faculty at McGill University as an associate professor in the School of Social Work. She's been involved in direct services, research, training, and knowledge transfer on multiple social issues related to family caregivers, social gerontology, social policy, and mental health. Her latest research focuses on women's bereavement experiences after caregiving. She's published several articles and co-edited a book on professional interventions with caregivers. She's a founding member and part of the coordination team of the Caregiver Grief Connection project, which is what they'll be presenting about today. And Zelda Freitas is a social worker and clinical senior advisor with professional practice of the Directorate of Rehabilitation and Multidisciplinary Services of the CEUS West Central Montreal. She's also an adjunct professor at McGill University School of Social Work. Her experience involves training, knowledge transfer, psychosocial support on issues related to caregiving, palliative and end-of-life care, and older adults. She presents at international and national conferences and participates in research projects and publications. She's also on several advisory boards and is a volunteer member of the McGill Council on Palliative Care. Zelda is another founding member of the Caregiver Grief Connection project and part of the coordination team.
So Zelda and I are here to connect with you all and talk to you about our project called the Caregiver Grief Connection. But because SHARP is for Services for Healthy Aging in the Right Place, we've adapted our presentation to include some preamble and some historical background to how we got to our project. So I'll just tell you quickly, our team are Zelda and I, and then 5 other people. Part of the experience has been working together and pulling from everyone's different experiences, many of whom have done work with family caregivers, and palliative care and end of life and different projects related. So it's been really enriching and amazing. And we say that we've gotten to this project as a team, but it's been decades that we've been working together. And so that we know what people bring to the table is, years of professional experience. So today we're going to work on increasing knowledge about post-caregiving grief. And of course, we'll unpack the terms post-caregiving and grief and look at some of the resources available for caregivers. So who are caregivers? Caregivers in Canada, and this is a snapshot on Quebec. They've done it across the province. It's fascinating and it's up to date. So as of 2023, this is who are Quebec caregivers. It's actually amazing that there's a body in Quebec, in Canada, who's working on a national caregiver strategy in government. And that this body works with all other agencies across the country to gather the information, but then to see also what resources are available for caregivers. So we talk about caregivers like we've always talked about caregivers, but the truth is, and Erica knows this very well, we've been talking about the needs of caregivers for over 25 years, almost 30 years since we really started the beginning of programming about caregivers. And we recognized very early on, they were very overwhelmed with the work and the tasks that were involved in caregiving. And it took decades for caregivers to get on the agenda and to be in the spotlight. So we're thrilled that this is part of the everyday conversation about healthcare and that we are looking at caregivers the way we are. So if you look at some of the numbers, it's pretty interesting. I don't have a pointer, but 21% of caregivers are age 65 and over. 20% are the baby boomers, and 18% are younger. But if you look at, baby boomer, if you look at the 55 to 64, the 45 to 54, the bottom half of that circle are all working people, are all employed people. So when we talk about caregivers, and that's a significant amount, we're talking often about caregivers who are in the workforce and are juggling multiple responsibilities, even the 18 to 24 range, who could be managing the care of siblings or parents or grandparents, even. And that's what we've seen a lot, multi-generational caregiving. So often caregivers do not access services because they don't recognize themselves as caregivers. They might think, it's my job. I'm a spouse, or I'm a sibling, or I'm a child or grandchild. That's just what I do. So people don't necessarily think, oh, let me go get services and support for my caregiving role. I'll just do what I have to do. And even if it's difficult. Um, and as we know, caregivers can present to their family physician or to their therapist or to colleagues and friends or employers as very tired, very worried, even anxious, and very consumed with the care and the health of their loved one. And financially, it is an incredible strain. There's excellent research on the financial strain, but it's been, I think it was said that caregivers save the healthcare system $25 billion a year. It's a very significant amount. And I think caregivers take on a lot financially, as well as emotionally and physically. And I think specific to this population, the specific to this group that we're talking to today, if you look at the challenges related to aging as who people are caring for, if you add cognitive decline or physical disability, if you add all these things as comorbidities, it's a very significant amount of people who are taking care of someone with many different issues at the same time.
I just wanted to add actually to what you just said, Pam, with regards to the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. If any of you have the opportunity to take a look at their website and get some information with regards to some of the things that they're doing, amazing work across Canada to improve the care and the support to caregivers. And actually, yesterday, their national caregiver strategy just came out, so it's public now, and I encourage you all to take a look at it, comment on it, get involved. There's a letter of support that you can send to your members of parliament, National Assembly, etc., to support the work moving forward with regards to putting together and putting in place a national caregiver strategy. So a Canadian-wide national strategy. It's a wonderful organization to get involved with, and really it's promoting what we need to do more in terms of caregivers. So we're going to talk a little bit about, well, we talk about caregiver grief and bereaved caregivers. We wanted to kind of just sort of give that a little bit of a framework in terms of what do we talk about when we talk about grief. So just a couple of definitions just to sort of get our head around what do we mean by when we talk about grief. And in English, interestingly enough, we have a number of different words that talk about grief, the experience of grief, and we're gonna just cover a couple of them. In French, there's one word, it's deuil, and it's interesting that we actually usually it's the other way around, but this time around, English has a couple of more words that go into a little bit finer detail as to what we mean by grief and the components of grief. So first, we talk about loss, and caregivers are not lost. Caregiving is not new. There's loss that occurs during caregiving that can have an impact on the caregiver grief experience. So when we talk about loss, we talk about the absence or the act or the fact of being unable to keep or maintain something or someone. That's a pretty general description of what loss is. But it's our inability to keep something with us, whether it's a person, a feeling, a goal, a relationship, and we have to let go of it, and that's our experience of loss. That has an impact, of course, on how we experience grief. Depending on what we lose, also has an impact on grief and how our will be. Grief is a universal and instinctual and adaptive reaction to the loss of a loved one. So, grief in our discussion is really related to the loss of a person. And not a goal, not a relation. It is, of course, relationships, etc. But it's not something that is other than the loss of of a physical person. And it impacts caregivers as everyone else in many and multiple ways. So we experience grief through our physical self, our emotional self, mentally, cognitively, spiritually, culturally. um, and it can be experienced in response to any kind of loss. So you can experience grief when you lose, for instance, a job, when you lose a friendship, when you lose a pet. But the grief experience that we're speaking to is the grief of a person that you've been caring for. Um, and the emotional reaction and the personal impact of loss cannot be predicted by any kind of model. So when we talk about grief, we really talk about it being a very unique experience. So we have some general observations and some general things that we could say about grief and the experience of caregiver grief, but really it is unique to each and every single individual. Mourning, on the other hand, is the act of a person who mourns is the conventional manifestation of sorrow. So that means expressions and representations that we have either in our own families or in our own culture, but also and in our society. So, for instance, one example of that is when we, as a country, put our flag at half mast when we have a grief experience that is experienced by multiple people. So, for instance, during COVID, you would see that there were some flags that were lowered during that period of time. If there is other manifestations of grief that are on a larger scale, you'll also see that that's how we mourn as a culture. That's one example of it. There are many others. Bereavement is really the experience of loss. So it's how we express our grief. One example of that is rituals that we have around the loss. The death of a loved one. There are rituals. Our society has over time kind of gotten away from certain rituals. Funerals, for instance, are a ritual, and other types of events around the death of someone that we love or someone in our family. Um, also leans on rituals, and what rituals do is help us together collectively uh, grieve. And that's is another very important element of grief as well. And it is unique to each person, and it's our expression of our grief. So it's an individual experience as well. So how we experience our grief, how we express our grief, is our way of bereaving that person. Quickly, just around myths and misconceptions, over the years, people have asked us and ask in general, when am I going to get over this very bad feeling that I have, which is this grief that I'm experiencing as a whole person. And there's a lot of myths out there around grief, and that's makes it harder for people to understand their own experience, because there are sometimes some expectations of people around us, norms that we think are norms around grief, such as one of them is you will grieve for 3 months and then you'll feel much better. That is a myth. Grieving is an ongoing process. It is unique to each and every individual, and there is no getting over grief. It's learning to live with that grief that you have and the loss of the person that you have experienced and what you have experienced. So there's no another myth around grief is what the stages of grief, like I'm going to feel this way for a while and then I'm going to feel anger for a while and then I'm going to feel this or that for a while and then it's all going to be over. Really, the experience of grief and what most people talk about, and when they talk about their own grief, is the second diagram that you see there, and it's all that mixed reactions that go on when we experience grief. There is no linear experience of grief. It's not A, B, C, or D, and then we're going to feel a certain way. It's really that sort of mixed. And you'll hear people say that yesterday I was feeling really good. I was feeling okay, and today it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And that is the sort of the back and forth of grief that we talk about. And so it is very unique again. Uh, uh, to each person, and we need to remember that because we can set ourselves up for unrealistic expectations of how we should be experiencing our own grief. As caregivers, as individuals, it's really important that we know there is no one way, it's our way. And what way is that is for us to know our own experience.
I could take this, Zelda. I just want to say one
Yeah,
thing about this. We were
yeah.
always taught that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief were, what people should expect when they're in grief. And I feel like this is such a great representation visually of what actually happens. And I think people, like Zelda said, people feel badly when they're not more advanced in their adjustment or bereavement, or if they're not further ahead, or if they keep coming back to emotional connections or things they should have done differently. And I feel like we need to normalize the fact that grief could be anything for anyone for as long as it takes. And I think, and we know there are, symptoms of complicated grief that have to be addressed. But for the most part, which is only for a very small percentage, I believe it's 10% or so, 10-15%. But for the most part, people live with their grief in a really fluid and flexible way.
Mm.
So some of the manifestations of grief, and this is from Pauline Orr, who works at the Teresa Deller Palliative Care Residence, and she does a lot of work on bereavement. Some of that she divided it up into 5 segments, but some of the people who are in bereavement or even yourselves could be dealing with some of these manifestations. It doesn't mean it's all or none. It could be some and sometimes. So physically, people who have difficulty sleeping, who find themselves short of breath, who have tightness or feel an inability to speak, who feel nauseous or have, sudden weight loss or gain, who feel fatigued, like from the core, a real sense of fatigue, who have lowered immunity and keep getting sick, and then some, aches and pains in their body. That could be a physical expression of grief. Emotionally, they could feel in a sense of shock or sadness on a regular basis, guilt about what they could have done differently. Something that's not here, but that I saw a lot in my research was that people felt a lot of resentment as well to some of the time they gave and some of the interactions. That was guilt and resentment sometimes went together. Another thing that's not here, but that's really relevant, is that people felt very depleted after the caregiving. They felt that they gave everything in their being, and then they were incredibly depleted and had a lot of difficulty resuming their life. Anger, fear, anxiety, loneliness, isolation. This has a lot to do with the relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver, which could have spanned 80 years, decades and decades of a relationship that shifted once the caregiving became prominent. Spiritual, so questioning questioning your the meaning of life, relations to a higher power, to God, challenge our notions of faith, religion, spirituality. This is common. Socially, people felt alone but less interested in talking to others. And they felt that others wanted them to be further ahead, to move on, to stop talking about it, to be a little more hopeful. And I think that's a very isolating feeling for people who are going through this. So it creates even more isolation when you have people that don't understand your situation. And then cognitive or behavioral implications could be that you could be excessively worrying or preoccupied with different things. You could have demonstrate some memory problems. Different things can occur, but any or all of these things could be part of the manifestations of grief for different people at different times. And again, this is another, we love visuals. Zelda and I love visuals, but this is another really incredible visual where it shows that it doesn't just go away, someone's grief, they just live with it in a different way. So people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time, but in reality, grief stays the same size, but life begins to grow bigger around it. And so um, this is a very good representation of people who try and resume their life or find a new life after, but have some difficulty adjusting. Okay, so there was the Canadian Grief Alliance had a huge study, almost 4,000 respondents, which is very big in terms of grief because people have a bit of a stigma talking about death and grief and loss. So here they did a great study, and the government's getting it this year. But the findings said that 53% of respondents said their grief went largely unrecognized by others. Very common. I'm actually surprised that's not more. Half of the respondents felt that they were inadequately supported in their grief. 83% said that just being asked about the loss was helpful. More than half wanted more access to one-on-one grief counseling. And 52% of respondents thought educating the public on how to better support each other would be helpful. There's another element where they talked about what could healthcare workers do? What could family physicians do? How can the support system, health and social services support system, help people in grief more? And there was a large number of respondents who said they would have liked their social worker or their nurse or their physiotherapist or the occupational therapist to follow them after the death so that they could continue the connection and the relationship and get more support after their person or their loved one had died.
So now we're going to talk just a little bit more around aging and grief. Interesting studies that have stated and reported that um, grief affects aging and it affects the way we age. And so it's important to acknowledge, and again, just to reinforce again what Pam and I are saying is reinforcing the need to acknowledge your grief and experience it in the way that you need to, in order to make sure that it doesn't affect you in a negative way. So one of the ways, so we sort of have this diagram of this circle that grief. We can have a grief experience. It could affect our physical health. Pam mentioned some of the symptoms of grief, physical grief. It also affects our appetite, which can then affect our health. It also could affect our cognition and make us feel more confused, out of focus. I recently lost both of my parents in the last 2 years or more or less, and I felt I really experienced this sort of sense of confusion and out of focus. I couldn't get my brain to focus as much as I wanted it to, and I had to acknowledge for myself that this is probably my body experiencing and my mind experiencing grief in its own subtle way. We can experience more isolation and loneliness, which can happen as we age as well. So we have to be careful that we're there are times when we're grieving where we want to isolate ourselves, where we want to be alone, where we want to just experience that grief on our own. But we also have to acknowledge that we need to be able to also be in community and be with family, so that we not necessarily to experience our grief, but to make those connections and maintain those connections. And those are really important as well as we get older, is to maintain connection. And so that double possibility of aging and grieving could really have an impact on those connections. So we have to be very aware of those, and also getting stuck in our grief, and not allowing ourselves to truly experience it, can block us and can lead to other complications in our health, whether it's our physical health or our mental health, and that could have a negative impact as we age as well. Some of the grief experiences as a caregiver could be also associated with uh, when we're actively caring. And there's two definitions that I wanted to bring forward when we talk about that type of grief. And one of them is, well, you may have heard of this term. It's called anticipatory loss or anticipatory grief, and that is really the grief that we experience as caregivers caring for someone. We experience the loss of that person before they're physically not with us anymore, and it's in anticipation of them not being present. I know that I as a caregiver experienced this anticipatory grief where I was imagining my future life without my mother. I was imagining what I would be doing, much I would miss her before she was gone. And so I don't, there's different studies around that. Some say that it's positive in some ways, that it helps us to anticipate perhaps how we might experience grief, although we don't really know what that will be like until it actually happens. But it is sort of preparing ourselves for that loss. Ambiguous loss, on the other hand, is a term that was created by Pauline Boss. If you're interested more in ambiguous loss, she's the real champion of the definition of it, how it impacts us. She's written a couple of books on it. She has a website on it if you're interested. But ambiguous loss, interestingly enough, is the loss of the person while they're still with us. Either they're physically present and not and cognitively not with us. So that would be an experience of if you're caring for someone who has a cognitive issue, and it also could be someone who is cognitively present, but physically not no longer with us. So it could be someone that's more of an experience of someone who is away, or lost, or someone who is experience. Or is away at, let's say, for instance, at fighting in war, for instance, where the person may be displaced, maybe not physically with us, but they are still present with us cognitively. And so Boss defines ambiguous loss as uncertain and unclear. It can lead us to a profound sense of loss and sadness, but it's not associated with the death of the person, but it is associated with that person. And the loss remains ambiguous to us. And what it what the experience is that it's quite a paradox, because the person, for instance, if you're caring for someone who is living with a type of a cognitive loss, you're experiencing the paradox is that they're present with you, um, but at the same time you're losing pieces of them through their loss of cognition. And each day could be an experience of loss that you're unprepared for. So for instance, my father had vascular dementia, and my experience with him was that from one day to the next, I wasn't quite sure if he was going to remember who I was. So every day was that experience of that potential loss experience. And then, when it happened, and you feel that you grieve that loss on when it happens. So it's all of that paradox between living with the person present, but at the same time losing, as we say, pieces of them on a day-to-day or a basis. So these rapid accumulation of losses could lead us into feeling a bereavement overload. And that's an expression that I found quite interesting because sometimes we don't look at it in that way. But there's a lot, if they were experiencing a lot of loss at one time, if we're caregiving for someone actively for a very extended period of time, and then we're experiencing grief and loss as we're caring for them, and then they're no longer physically there with us, we experience grief overload or bereavement overload, but we also might be experiencing other losses that come with that. We're losing our identity as a caregiver, but we might also be losing the support, the relationship that we had with that person. Some people financially, their situation becomes quite unsteady, and other relationships that we might lose as well because they were connected to that person. So there's a number of different things that can go on at once. When we talk about bereaved caregivers and supporting bereaved caregivers, we know, as Pam mentioned, that caregiving has an impact on our whole being. Um, and if our identity as a caregiver, along with our other identities that we have as individuals, take over of our other identities, it becomes our main role. As a caregiver, where we're more and more into that role, and we may need to let go of some of the other things that we do because there's no time for everything. um, that can make it very difficult when we're no longer in a position where we're caring for the person that we were caring for. So why support bereaved caregivers? Well, because we believe that caregiving um, has an effect on losses and multiple and can have also multiple and compound losses. So, we experience as caregivers the death of the person we were caring for when that happens, the loss of our identity as a caregiver, the relationship, our relationship identity as well with that person, and we may feel a sense of loss of meaning. If we really, as a caregiver, our identity and our meaning in our life was attached to that role, we could also experience quite a loss of meaning as well. And this could lead to complex grief, or it could lead to grief, and acknowledgement of that very specific grief as a caregiver. We have a bereaved caregiver that we were in contact with, and she said it quite succinctly. She said the grief is very different because the caregiving was so intense. Every function of her life, the person she was caring for, was our responsibility. So all of that uh, goes with the person when they die. So caregiver grief after the death of the person is impacts. Caregiving continue to be impacted by their role. So what we're Pam and I are saying through our caregiver grief connection project and our team is that caregiving doesn't end with the end of the act of care. That caregiving uh, continues on into the grief phase where we're grieving being a caregiver, and that is quite significant, and it's experienced differently from by caregivers versus those that are not actively caregiving. And it's important to consider post caregiving as part of the caregiver trajectory, as part of caregiving. That it caregiving does not end when active caregiving occurs. And our Pam has an interesting quote from her work that she did extensively looking at caregiver identity and loss of identity related to caregiving. And she said the impact of the loss may vary depending on the caregiving experience, the relationship that you've had, and the timing of the caregiving in a person's life, the person's commitment to caregiving, and how the caregiving influenced their sense of self among others. So all of this impacts the experience of grief of caregivers.
And we love this image of the bridge because you're, in a sense, passing from the side of caregiving to post caregiving, but the bridge is, deeply affected by the history and anything that could have gone on in the relationship. And it's over water and you're transitioning from one place to the other. But at the same time, you're taking with you, all that you've lived. So we often use a bridge analogy in our project because it's
hmm
post care.
And I would say, as a caregiver, as a post caregiver, I'd say I'm probably halfway through that bridge. I'm not quite on the other side, like I'm not quite integrated, like you said, that caregiving grief experience is not complete. It's not totally processed just yet. And so I love that bridge because it sort of helps also us as grieving caregivers. Where do we situate ourselves? Where are we in our process? And it for me, it's a visual image of where I am in my process, and it could be helpful to others as well.
And there's people along the bridge in different parts, so you
Yeah.
really see that. I did a lot of work on post-caregiving identity and the roles, and what we found was someone's personal identity is really impacted by the relationship and caregiving and their experiences. And that in a lot of ways, caregivers give up a lot, some of their identities to become full-time caregivers so they could stop going to their job or their volunteer work or their time with their grandchildren or their time with their children or anything that gave them pleasure, they might have given up in a sense so that they could have more time in caregiving. And thus, it has a very big influence on someone's identity and the meaning and the purpose of their life. And so that's why afterwards, there's a lot of difficulty reclaiming what they once found meaningful or purposeful. So caregiving becomes more and more like the primary driver of their identity. And even, socially, some people, if they're taking care of someone with a cognitive impairment, they might not want to be in different social situations with that person in case behavioral issues or outbursts or different things might be just too much socially. So um, we assume that caregivers, the in the post-caregiving phase, they're able to readjust and to their new life or find a new identity. It's actually quite complex. And what we saw in the research was that people had a lot of difficulty reclaiming who they were or finding new ways to find a new role and create new identities. Some caregivers even went to find other caregiving roles in their family because that was where their sense of meaning was most significant. And what we want to acknowledge as friends or workers or anything when it comes to someone who's in a grief is that there are losses that happen during the caregiving, um, and that transitioning out of caregiving into a post-caregiving phase is not simple. And what Zelda and I have always argued is that post-caregiving is really part of the caregiving life course, that we cannot forget this part, that we need to support caregivers from the beginning when they enter into caregiving beyond the end of caregiving, so that we're really giving a full, comprehensive amount of support to the caregiving trajectory, as we say. Um, so what do we do? What do we do in our support and why do we do it? So we're going to talk about our project in a little bit, but basically we want to um, support caregivers and allow and encourage them to feel all the feelings and feel what they feel as we support them, and that we normalize their experiences and tell them to be patient with themselves and others and the timing, and to not put any parameters about their grief, about how long it should take and when they should be back into life and what they should be feeling and when they should find happiness or joy again. We just want to tell them that, as Zelda said, like, your experience is yours and it doesn't follow any pathway. It's just what it is for you.
So what we want, what our message is that we have to welcome grief, because if we don't, it could have a lot of negative impacts on our life. And I mean, as we're talking about, older and aging lives, um, we have to be very careful that it doesn't have that negative impact that it can have. So how do you welcome grief? These are just some ideas that we could reflect on. One is around starting conversations, like today. We're starting a conversation with all of you about grief, about caregiver grief. And we encourage you to have those conversations with others around you, with your groups, with your committees, with your family. Um, It helps to also listen. We talk about listening as a whole person, and being engaged and letting people tell their story, and listen to their stories, and have space for us to also tell our story. Because by sharing our stories, we're integrating that loss into our cognitive being, but also our whole being. And we're accepting of those stories as people that are receiving those stories as well. We've had, death in our society has been quite taboo, and it has led to people experiencing grief and loss in a very isolated kind of way, where we don't want to talk about grief, or we don't want to talk about the person that they lost, or we don't want to mention their name. And all of these things can be very negative for the person that is experiencing that grief. So you could ask, how are you feeling today? Do you want to talk about, you know, your experience with uh, the person that you lost? And that's just opening up the conversation. It doesn't mean that that person may say, you know what, today I really don't feel like talking about my mom, for instance. But thank you for asking. As Pam said in that grief survey, just even acknowledging and just saying, hey, how are you doing today? Do you want to talk about it? Can have a really positive impact. It allows us as a community to say that it's okay. We're going to have good days and we're going to have bad days. The other thing is to be open. Remember that there's a wide range of grief experiences. So as much as possible, try not to fix. We, as human beings, we want to help other people. We want to help them solve their difficulties, when they're in distress or they're suffering. And it's hard to bear witness to that. But by being present, rather than giving them very quick solutions as how they could feel better, can be much more positive for them. And we're going to talk about identifying resources, as well, and that's another way that we could help each other. So some of the ways that we wanted to mention is that we need to talk about building blocks of resilience. How do we make ourselves more resilient? That word is a very popular word right now. How do we make ourselves, you know, at the same time, being able to express ourselves and express our feelings and express our grief, but at the same time, how do we also increase our ability to cope? And there are a number of different ways. We hear about, most recently, tips and prevention ideas. They're all about the same, more or less, but it's how you will incorporate those into your own life. So uh, maintaining and expanding our social networks, our social engagement, hobbies, things that bring you joy. So, my question to you, and my challenge to you today is, what brings you joy? And identify whatever brings joy to you. Do more of that, as long as it's safe and it's healthy and it's good for you. Do more of it. Talk about grief, talk about loss, and allow others to do the same. Make aging. We need to make aging part of living. We need to make sure that it's not something that happens to somebody else, but it's something that's happening and throughout our lives, and we have to incorporate that, the aging aspect of our human existence, so that we could approach it in a much more healthier way. um, the other important things are art and music. More recently, I've heard a lot about how art can have such a positive impact, not only on our aging but also on grieving, and music as well, of course. And face masks. Face masks basically just take care of yourself. Do things that are important to you, that are special to you, whether it's with face masks, or getting your hair done, or whatever it might be, having a wonderful evening with friends. It's that engagement and self-care that is really important, that help us reduce some of the risk factors that could happen, that are there, in grieving and caregiver grief. So our project is called the Caregiver Grief Connection, and our goals are really to increase support to bereaved caregivers, because we acknowledge that there is a lack of support, and also to help equip people, individuals, whether they're professionals or families or friends or communities, on increasing that support to bereaved caregivers. How are we planning on doing that, and how are we presently doing that? Well, we have a lot of different projects going on, but our aims are really to develop tools to educate care providers and caregivers on grief. Website. We have a website that we're developing and improving on a daily basis almost, with populating it with information and resources on caregiver grief, where people can go and find the information that they need on caregiver grief. Because what caregivers have told us over the years is that they don't see themselves, they don't know where they are in the grief in grief resources. Sometimes they'll say, I went to a grief support group, but they weren't talking about my particular experience as a caregiver. So part of that is to develop more resources around bereaved caregivers, make bereavement support groups more specific to caregiver grief. These are some of our aims as we move forward, is just to include, as Pam said, the idea that caregiver grief is needs to be acknowledged as part of the life course of a caregiver, and that we need to develop resources and services that to fill the gaps that we're recognizing exist. And one of those gaps is also research. So one of the things that we're participating is in our pilot project, which is called the telehealth outreach program. And basically, that is a small research project that we're doing with a local healthcare network, on, uh, equip educating students that we have, social work students, on connecting with caregivers, bereaved caregivers, on virtually, whether it's by telephone or on Zoom, for instance, for a period of time up to 6 months, so that they can help that caregiver with the unique grief experience that they're having at that moment. So we're hoping that that was one way that we feel might be a way to help validate and support bereaved caregivers during that transition time, and connecting them to, of course, resources and community resources that are already in existence that they may not be aware of, whether it's online or in person. um, that's our plan. And of course, we're working with McGill University and a research center to ensure that we're addressing the caregiver grief in a way that is validated and is based on a good practice and good knowledge. So basically, the vision of it, just to give you a brief idea of what the telehealth outreach program is really, like I said, is to support grieving caregivers by bridging their needs with support, with follow up, and with referral to resources. And that we have trained and supervised social work interns from McGill School of Social Work that are working with us. We've been very lucky to have a good relationship and a partnership with the school, and with great students that are very interested in supporting people living with grief, and caregivers living with grief. And this is our website and our project, and we hope to be able to connect with you. You can link to our website. You can also subscribe. There is also the possibility of asking us questions or asking us anything that you want. We have an email address that you can access through the website. We also have a telephone number that you can call. So if there have any questions at all about caregiver grief, or any resources or any ideas about future projects, anything at all that you think could help, you know, can help continue this conversation and improve the care to bereaved caregivers, we are very happy to connect with you as we move forward. Another project that we're involved with as well is more with regards to grief and loss, with individuals and their families that are living in long-term care, residential care settings. And so there also the need to improve the delivery of care in the long-term care settings when it comes to end of life care and palliative care. And so that's another project that we're also participating in, is specifically with caregivers of residential care settings, and how to improve the care to their family member, but also to the caregiver as well. So there's a number of different uh, supports out there as well that we're hoping to let people know more and more about. So um, There's bereavement support groups that are available throughout Quebec and Canada. Some of them are online, some of them are in person. There's also other types of telephone helplines. There's a resource called the Canadian Virtual Hospice, and they are in association with the Canadian Grief Alliance, and they have a number of resources as well on their website. If you have an opportunity, go on their website. It's full of really good information. They have one particular segment of their website that's called mygrief.ca, and it's really to help people connect across Canada about grief. So that's a really important resource. The other one is through our libraries in Quebec. The Association of Quebec Libraries or something to that effect. They have a number of resources as well that they've put forward. And their resources are little booklets, online booklets of different kinds of movies, books, and resources that are linked to particular subjects. And they have one on bereavement, they have one on caregiving. So if you're interested, they have been both English and French resources. And it's a really, really interesting resource to have if you want to sort of reflect a little further on what is this whole experience of grief? What is happening to me? What's going on? What can I find out from what other people have experienced? A lot of times we question ourselves on whether or not we feel that our grief is normal. Am I losing my mind? Am I feeling that this is not I'm not experiencing this like maybe others are. And again, very unique experience to each and every person, but there is a lot of information out there too to help us kind of reflect on what's happening to us. So, in conclusion, we just want to say that as a part of the caregiver grief connection, that education about grief is really really important. And without us really understanding grief and understanding caregiver grief, it's really hard to maybe miss some of the warning signs for ourselves that maybe we need to be taking care of ourselves, and so that's really important. So education, hopefully we were able to accomplish that, a little bit of that today for you and with you. That bereaved will benefit from learning that the pain that they are feeling serves a purpose. It'll help with healing, and that you're not alone, and that grief is not bad, and that the process requires time. And that's always the hardest part, right? Is like when we're not feeling great, it's hard to be and sit with that for a long period of time. And you don't necessarily need to be sitting with grief in that intense experience at all times. So it's important to reach out and know where you can seek out support. And it's important to talk about the person, also the person who died, the person that you may have been caring for. We want to hear about them. Don't want them to be forgotten either. So it's important to honor them and honor the caregiving that you provided for them. And I really like this quote: is you have power over your mind, but not outside events. And if we realize that, we have a lot more strength. So building our inner strength about knowing and educating ourselves and learning more about caregiver grief could help us really with as we build our own strength and moving forward.
The first question in here asks, can grief come in waves?
Absolutely. I'll jump right into that. It sort of talks it to like when we're saying one day we're feeling okay, the next day not so great. It does. One of the ways that people describe grief is actually through an analogy of waves. It comes and goes. Some days are, more you know, turbulent than others. Um, and it could be just the way we're feeling that day. Sometimes it takes us by surprise. We are saying, "Oh, okay, we're kind of moving along," and then boom, all of a sudden we wake up and it's just a bad day. That grief hits us that day. It could be something we've seen,
Mm.
heard, smell. Um, you know, uh, Sometimes it's reminders or memories, whether they're physical or cognitive. So yes, it does definitely comes in waves, and we have to, like we say, ride those waves, and get through them.
So another question came in the chat about the difference, whether there's a difference in grieving for older people versus for younger people.
Mm. You mean us grieving for an older person or grieving for someone a younger person?
I think it's the
Yeah.
opposite.
Oh.
I think it's the age that you are when you are grieving.
Oh, okay. Yes, actually, they do say that there is a difference, and sometimes those differences um, are again individual, but they also could be associated with age. So what
Yeah.
I've read is that they say that younger individuals, um, they might experience grief as something more sudden, something more
Mm,
acute. So that grief experience is different. As with maybe older people, they are experiencing perhaps losses over an extended period of time, and
mm,
that grief experience will be different.
mm,
Another thing they say also is that there is a myth out there that I've heard, and maybe some of you have heard and experienced, when they say that, oh, older people don't experience grief in as intensity as younger people do. And the reason for that is
mm,
for what I just actually said before was there might be a lot of different losses that they're experiencing. So, the misconception is that, oh well, we get used to it. We get used to
mm,
losses and grieving, so we're better at it, which is absolutely false.
mm,
Losing, your mom at the age of 50, or losing your mom at the age of 75, or you're still losing a significant person in your life. You're losing that relationship. So we have to be careful that we don't assume that older people can handle or cope with grief better because they've had more experience with it. It's a really each
mm,
relationship is grieved in a different way. So yeah.
mhm, mhm,
I wanted to add that also the relationship that you have with the person that you've been caring for. So, one of the things that came up most recently for us in the caregiver grief connection is the whole relationship of siblings and the grief that siblings can experience as caregivers and as siblings can be quite different from the experience of a
mm,
parent or a partner, for instance. So, your relationship with the person that you're caring for and and that you're grieving is has an impact on your grief as well. So that's, I think, important for us to remember. So how my children as grandchildren experience the grief of their grandmother is different than my experience as a child of
right.
you know yeah, that's right. And sometimes the support is very practical. How to, take care of the practicalities of your home situation. If you've never really taken care of, some of the little house repairs or things
Mm,
and you've shared those responsibilities, you may feel like, oh my goodness, all of this now is on me. And how am I going to take care of all of this? Well, that's another impact that grief has as well. Even if you were caring for someone that may have had, and been in an advanced illness condition, they still
mm,
participated. They may have still, contributed greatly to the maintenance
absolutely.
of your household in different ways, right? So, yeah, it definitely can have a impact on a lot
Yeah.
of different aspects of our life.
There's a question from Diane at A. Cole about MAID, and I don't know if that's something that you're comfortable addressing. It's a little bit off topic, but would that be different when death is anticipated and planned? So is the grief different um,
Yeah.
when death is anticipated and planned?
Yeah, something that us in the caregiver grief world and then the caregiver world have been concerned about, actually.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of research in the area just yet, but definitely we've explored the idea that grief could be and is different, um,
Mm,
because of it for a number of different reasons. And one of them could be whether or not you're in alignment with that
mm,
decision that the person has made, so that could have a negative impact on your grief.
mm,
The amount of support that you felt during that process as well could have an impact um, on your grief as well. Um, so those are some of the amount of you know, maybe not in today's world, but when MAID was first introduced in 2015, definitely for the first few years, and continues to this day, I mean, talking about culturally as well, is that people are ashamed or don't want to talk about the fact that their person that they were caring for or their family member um, asked and received MAID. And so that might be, they might feel stigmatized because MAID is a very, controversial subject in our society, can be controversial. And so people might keep their grief to themselves in secret. And what we are saying before is that we need to, it's important to share that with others. So if you're had an experience of MAID and you don't want to share that, you feel maybe it's stigmatized in some way,
Mm,
that could have an impact on your grief as well. So there are a number of issues around it that we're very interested in exploring because we are concerned about its impact on caregivers.
mm,
You lose appetite and you feel loneliness and you feel confused at the same time. Is that normal?
Yeah, I would say it is. Um, I th- it is normal, or it's a normal reaction to grief to feel lonely. Even though people sometimes feel lonely, even though they have a lot of people around them, because grief is unique to you, and even though there are people around you also grieving the loss of that individual, of that person, you are experiencing it in your own way, and sometimes we tend to isolate ourselves in that and we don't share that with those around us. We don't want to burden sometimes other people. I know that
mm,
I felt like that at one point where I was feeling overwhelmed at while I'm on a particular day with my grief, but I didn't want to share that with necessarily with my children because they were also experiencing their own grief. So sometimes that just
mm,
isolates us rather than saying, you know what, today's not a good day. Today's just not the greatest day, and we just need to hug or have a good memory about so and so, and that might help us all. So um, we have to be conscious of that isolation, possibility of isolating ourselves from others, even those that are also grieving that same person. And confusion, I think it goes to speak to uh, the idea that grief can impact us also in our cognitive, in our mind, um, and sometimes that's might be where it sits. I could tell you just from my experience, there were certain days that I just didn't feel grounded, and I just didn't understand it because I had never really experienced that before. And so I would remember saying to a friend, they would ask me, how are you feeling? And I would say, you know what, I kind of feel okay, but I just don't feel grounded sometimes. I feel like I was sort of floating a little bit, and that's sort of how grief was impacting my cognition, my ability to
mm,
to be clear, to be focused.
mm,
And I think that's where what we meant by confusion, like absent-mindedness, or just not getting it together, or forgetting things. That could also be part of grief. Of course, it can be part of other things, but it definitely could. If you've had a recent grief experience, you could possibly link it to that, but just be cautious that
mm,
that it might be something else. So don't ignore other symptoms, but it could be for sure
mm.
associated with grief.
And I think I mean, I think that was an excellent question and an excellent answer and a good way to start to wrap things up. But really, I think like what's really stood out for me is the idea of welcoming grief, the idea that it really is an individual experience. There's no right way, there's no right timeline. Everybody's experience is going to be very, very different, and it's all okay. Thank you again, Zelda, and I'll thank Pam when I talk to her after as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us, and we're really happy to have this conversation with all of you,
Yeah,
and continue the conversation. All right. Thanks so much,
perfect.
everybody.
Thank you. Have a
Bye-bye.
good
Have a great
afternoon,
day.
everyone. Bye.